The first story starts with this man who found a real-life infinite money glitch. The man's name is Dan, and Dan is 29 years old when this story starts. He's a bartender living in Australia. One night in 2011, Dan is out drinking at a bar, having a good time, when he suddenly realizes he's out of cash. So he leaves the bar and walks to the nearest ATM. There, he tries to transfer $200 from his credit card into his savings account. But for some reason, the transfer doesn't work. The ATM screen keeps flashing. Transfer canceled. Then it spits his card back out. Dan gets weirded out, so he tries again. This time, instead of transferring money, he tries to withdraw $200 directly from his savings account. And it works. The strange part? Dan didn't actually have $200 in his savings account. Some kind of glitch is happening. At that moment, Dan is a bit drunk, so he doesn't really question it. He takes the money, leaves, and goes back to drinking. Later that night, when he's leaving the bar, he walks past the same ATM again and starts wondering if he can make the glitch work a second time. So he tries again. He transfers another $200 from his credit card to his savings account, and once again he's able to pull out the cash. That's when Dan decides to push it further. He tries $500. It works. Then $600. That works too. At that point, Dan realizes he's discovered something serious. An infinite money glitch. He repeats the process a few more times, takes the cash, and goes home. After testing it night after night, Dan eventually figures something out. As long as he transfers a small amount of money from his credit card every night, his bank balance stays positive. And that means he can keep transferring money into his own account forever, or at least until he gets caught. So that's exactly what he does. Every night, Dan walks to the ATM and takes out thousands of dollars. In just the first 2 weeks alone, he withdraws more than $20,000, little by little each night. The glitch only works between 1 and 3 in the morning, when the ATMs go offline. Every day, Dan expects the police to show up at his door. And every day they don't. Weeks go by, and the bank still doesn't seem to notice. They don't call him. They don't email him. Dan even goes to the bank in person just to see if he's been flagged. But no one says anything. So he keeps going. Every night between 1 and 3 a.m., Dan transfers money from his credit card to his savings account and then pulls it out as cash from the ATM. Before long, Dan has made so many transfers and withdrawals that he technically becomes a millionaire. That's when things change. Dan starts living big. He eats at expensive restaurants, stays in luxury hotels, goes on vacations, and buys designer clothes. At one point, he even rents a private jet for $90,000 to fly himself and his friends to an exotic island in Asia for the weekend. He gambles a lot too, since he's into that. And because Dan is a nice guy, he's often generous, tipping waiters hundreds of dollars and even paying for hotel rooms so homeless people can have a place to sleep. Dan is now living like a millionaire, and according to him, this lifestyle even helps him have more success with the ladies. Most people have no idea what's really going on. Only his close friends know about the ATM glitch. Everyone else just assumes Dan is rich. When people ask how he makes his money, he tells them he works in real estate or that he's an investment banker, and nobody questions it. But while Dan looks carefree on the outside, mentally, things are falling apart. Dan has never done anything truly illegal in his life, nothing big like this. And slowly, paranoia takes over. Every morning, he wakes up wondering if today will be the day he gets caught. He starts having nightmares about SWAT teams smashing through his door. Every time his phone rings, he expects it to be the bank or the police. But it never is. And when the bank does call, it's only to confirm routine transactions for security reasons. Nothing suspicious. Nothing alarming. Dan knows he could run. With millions of dollars, disappearing would be easy. But that would mean living as a fugitive, never seeing his family or friends again. Eventually, the stress becomes too much. After 4 months of exploiting the ATM glitch, Dan finally stops. In total, he withdraws and spends more than $1.6 million. Instead of moving on, Dan does something unexpected. He calls the bank and confesses everything. The bank tells him they can't do much immediately, but they say they'll report him to the police, and that he'll be in serious trouble. Dan waits. Nothing happens. Years pass. By 2014, 3 full years later, the police still haven't contacted him. The bank never follows up. Most people would move on. Dan can't. The guilt and anxiety eat at him so badly that he starts seeing a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist suggests that, to find peace, Dan should consider turning himself in. Dan doesn't do that. Instead, he comes up with another idea. He goes public. Dan starts doing interviews, appearing on TV, and telling his story openly. Even then, the police still don't act, until one of the TV producers quietly contacts the authorities and reports him. That's when the truth comes out. The police were never investigating Dan at all. The bank never actually reported him. Dan is immediately arrested. During the trial, no one, not the bank, not the prosecutor, not even the judge, fully understands how the glitch worked. Dan's explanations only add more confusion. Because of that, Dan receives a relatively light sentence. 1 year in prison. And that's the story of how a bartender accidentally found an infinite money glitch, and how it eventually caught up with him. This next story starts with this man. He was caught passing off his own daughter as his wife. His name was Albert, and this story begins when he was about 42, living in Ontario, Canada. Albert was a shady guy, the kind who looked successful on the surface. He owned a financial services company where he supposedly helped people invest their money. But the truth was that it was all a scam. Albert was running a Ponzi scheme. Still, he made plenty of money, and he loved showing it off. Expensive vacations, flashy cars, and all the posh luxuries that made him look legitimate. But in 1987, everything started falling apart. The stock market crashed, investors got nervous, and soon they began demanding their money back. It didn't take long before Albert ran out of funds to pay them, because, of course, there was no real investment behind it. His clients grew impatient and angry, and Albert knew it was only a matter of time before the entire scheme collapsed. To make matters worse, he was going through an ugly divorce at the same time. His life was spiraling, caught between furious investors and personal chaos. So Albert made a decision. He would flee the country, and he planned to take one of his kids with him. In 1990, he grabbed what remained of the investors' money, took his 15-year-old daughter Sheena, and ran. They traveled from Canada to London, England. Altogether, Albert had defrauded clients of about $3.2 million, so there's no telling how much cash he escaped with. Eventually, his ex-wife realized what he had done and alerted the police, and Albert was placed on Interpol's most wanted list. Meanwhile, Albert and Sheena didn't stay in London long. They bounced around Europe, first Paris, then Geneva, trying to leave a confusing trail behind them. By 1991, they settled in Harrogate, England, a quiet, low-key town where blending in wasn't too hard. Albert changed his name, and together they created a disturbing cover story. Sheena, still just a teenager, would pose as his wife. Albert figured traveling with a young girl might raise suspicion otherwise, so they stuck to the lie. Shockingly, it worked. They kept their heads down, attended church every Sunday, and appeared completely normal to everyone around them. Still, Albert knew a fake name wouldn't hold up forever. One background check could expose him as a fugitive. He needed something stronger, real identities for both himself and Sheena. That's when he came up with an outrageous plan. Find a local couple, persuade them to leave the country, and then take over their identities. In 1992, Albert walked into a fine arts auction shop looking for paintings and met a woman named Elaine. He struck up a conversation and learned she was dating a man named Ronald. Elaine was 31, Ronald was 49, and they dreamed of moving to Canada someday but lacked the money to do it. To Albert, this sounded like an opportunity. He began laying the groundwork for a con. He offered Elaine work, photographing fountains in Geneva for a coffee table book and scouting real estate in France, and paid her well. Eventually, he hired both Elaine and Ronald as directors in a company he set up in England, conveniently gaining access to their signatures. But despite their dream, the couple didn't seem to be making real plans to relocate. Albert grew impatient. Finally, he decided to push matters along. As a Christmas gift, he bought them one-way plane tickets to Canada. This time it worked, they packed up and left. With them gone, Albert stepped fully into Ronald's identity, while Sheena assumed Elaine's. For about 6 months, Everything went smoothly. No suspicion, no trouble, until Elaine suddenly returned to England. Things hadn't worked out in Canada, and she couldn't find a job. Albert panicked. If she discovered what he'd done, everything would collapse. He tried convincing her to return to Canada, even offering money, but she refused. She was done with the place. To avoid exposure, Albert quietly moved away, first to Devon, then to Essex, hoping to stay out of her reach. Then things got even worse. The real Ronald also returned from Canada. Now Albert knew the clock was ticking. In his mind, there was only one solution. He invited Ronald on a boat trip. Once they were alone out on the water, Albert grabbed an anchor and struck him on the head, knocking him unconscious. He then threw Ronald overboard, and Ronald drowned. Albert went back to living under Ronald's name, and for a short while no one suspected a thing. 2 weeks later, however, a fisherman discovered Ronald's body floating in the water and alerted the Coast Guard. The police began investigating. During the examination, they found a Rolex watch on Ronald's wrist. Rolex maintains detailed service records tied to serial numbers, and investigators used this information to identify the body. Once they dug into Ronald's identity, they discovered that someone else had been living under his name, Albert. He was arrested, put on trial, found guilty, and ultimately sentenced to life in prison.